Hello. Welcome to Hoosier Memories. I'm Nancy, just a history nerd, and today I have an unanswered question. Did George Washington ever have any children? Well, if you said you didn't know, join the club, and here's why. At one time, there was a popular belief here in Indiana that President Washington had an illegitimate son, and his name was Thomas Posey. He was the last Indiana territorial governor, a man who has largely been forgotten but has left his mark on our state. Thomas Posey was born in Virginia in 1750 on a farm not far from George Washington's Mount Vernon. His life was full of controversy, and there were constant questions concerning who his true father was and who helped him to succeed in his career. Few facts are known about the parentage of Thomas Posey. The Posey family grew up in Rover's Delight, the small plantation owned by Captain John and Martha Posey. Captain John Posey was the ferry operator between Fairfax County, Virginia, and Marshall's Landing in Maryland, which just happens to be southwest of Mount Vernon. He ran the ferry from 1752 until his sale of his business to George Washington in 1772. Captain Posey was a friend, business associate, and hunting partner of our future president, and eventually he sold virtually all of his estate to Washington to repay loans. Now, as for the rumors. 1. Thomas Posey was born out of wedlock to Martha, his mother, before she married John Posey. Possible. 2. It was alleged he was the illegitimate son of John Posey and another unnamed woman. Or 3. Many thought that he might have been the natural son of 17-year-old George Washington and an unnamed young lady who died giving birth, and then young Thomas was taken in by the Posey family. And yes, everyone knows that George Washington was as sterile as a mule, but he wasn't born that way. Prior to leaving with his brother to Barbados in 1751, he was as normal as any man. And keep in mind that this was just a year after Thomas Posey was born. But while staying in this house, George contracted both smallpox and tuberculosis, which left him sterile and unfortunately killed his brother. So, this rumor is possible, but not proven. And yet, whoever Thomas Posey's parents were, it's important to remember that he was raised by Captain Posey. Often he was asked if he was Washington's son, which, frankly, took some nerve. But his answer was always the same. He would say that he was born of respectable parentage and poor but proud Virginia heritage. Now, this would not have excluded Washington, as his family was considered land poor until he married Martha Custis, the wealthiest widow in the colonies. So again, it's possible, but it's not proven. Now, as I show you the image of Thomas Posey with the images of each potential father, remember that Governor Posey's portrait, as seen in the state capitol, was copied from a miniature and not painted until well after the Civil War. The artist created a portrait of a man much younger than Thomas Posey's 63 years. And we have no actual portrait of a young George Washington, only other artists' assumptions. Thomas Posey was a commissary general for Colonel Andrew Lewis's brigade in Lord Dunmore's War in 1774, and he rose to lieutenant colonel in the 7th Virginia Regiment during the Revolutionary War. A rapid rise in rank by anyone's standards. It leads me to believe that he had some very good connections. After the war, Posey wrote a letter to George Washington in June of 1791. At that time, he was serving as Justice of the Peace and County Lieutenant. In his letter, he talks all about how he has so many children, 6 of his own, 3 stepchildren, and he needed a better job. I mean, he really laid it on thick. In part, he wrote, "Should any place offer in the naval or revenue departments or in the military that might be desirable, I should conceive myself under very great obligations to my benefactors were I to meet with an appointment." And on and on. Well, he writes George Washington again, later in 1791, and it begins with, "Some time since I took an occasion to write to you, but held up the letter until now, from a thought that I might be too troublesome. But I trust your goodness will excuse my boldness. I am more and more confirmed that a change in my mode of life must take place." Well, that must have worked, because later, in 1793, George Washington appoints him as Brigadier General. However, never settling for long, Thomas Posey resigned his commission the following year so that he could serve in the legislature of Kentucky, where he stayed a bit longer. He then moved on to Louisiana, where he served in the U.S. Senate from 1812 to 1813. It was then he was appointed by President James Madison to succeed William Henry Harrison as the last governor of the Indiana Territory in 1813. Now, once he was here, he became very popular with the voting population, and many of whom believed he was George Washington's son. Where this idea would have originated in the West Territory, it can't be determined. Possibly from Posey himself? We don't know. However, while the Corydon Capitol building became the interim capital, and during the middle of the very first General Assembly session, Thomas Posey remained in Jeffersonville, where he built a mansion on the banks of the Ohio and could be closer to his doctor in Louisville. He was of the belief that the government was where the governor is, and so he consequently made Jeffersonville the de facto capital of the territory. If you've ever passed under the Abraham Lincoln Bridge, you've driven by the site of Thomas Posey's mansion. As you can imagine, the territorial representatives weren't happy about having to travel to discuss matters with the governor. But, knowing that statehood was coming soon, cooler heads prevailed, and the members of the legislative branch agreed to travel, or hire a courier to travel, the rough roads between Corydon to Jeffersonville, at a cost of approximately $50 per day for the state. Nevertheless, Thomas Posey did do some very good things for the soon-to-be state. He approved the charter for the Bank of Vincennes, which led to future economic advancement, and that was desperately needed for a new state. He oversaw the formation of Indiana's judicial system, modeling it after the federal system. And despite that, those in power had refused to approve his ideas for road construction and for the framework he created for basic educational facilities. Well, the reason was, it was just too late. He had burned too many bridges with those who could have helped him politically. He was widely disliked by the legislature for his inaccessibility and for his pro-slavery sentiments in a territory that was predominantly anti-slavery. Another problem for him was that he felt that statehood should be postponed, and he actually had a point when he claimed that the territory's population was too sparse to bear the taxation that would be necessary to effectively grow the state, and instead he recommended that they remained a territory, and then they could continue to receive federal aid. But statehood fever had taken hold, and he would be on the losing side of that argument. The legislature began pressing for statehood, and Congressman Jonathan Jennings proposed federal legislation to approve statehood, and Indiana became a state in October 1816. Thomas Posey likely felt that he had already kept the seat warm and that he would likely be the winner of the state's first governor's election. Running against Jonathan Jennings, he was soundly defeated by Jennings, 5,211 to 3,934 votes. Ouch. Afterwards, he decided that he would run for Congress, hoping to gain Jennings' vacant seat, but lost again. He then moved away from Indiana and finished his career as an Indian agent in Illinois, negotiating treaties with the Wea, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi. He died of typhus fever on March 19th of 1818 in Shawneetown in Illinois, and he's buried in Westwood Cemetery in Shawneetown. He was 67 years old. Thomas Posey was a charitable and personally liked man in the territory. He was an active member of the Presbyterian Church and became president of a Bible society, which distributed free Bibles to the poor, not unlike the Gideons today. But he is best remembered as possibly being the illegitimate child of George Washington. One reason was that those old enough to remember Washington as a young man, but knew Thomas as an adult, were convinced of a family resemblance. Also, in tribute to Governor Posey, in 1825, during General Lafayette's final tour, the general wanted to specifically see the home of his dear friend, Thomas Posey. High regards for a man of such simple beginnings. That being said, the truth will probably never be known without DNA evidence, something that may never happen, and here is why. First, Mount Vernon is likely not to take part, as it adds nothing to their presentation of the father of our country. Secondly, the Posey descendants have every right to their privacy and haven't shown an interest in the rumor. And yet, to show how many people believed the rumor, a county in the southwest corner of the state was named for him in honor of his service, Posey County. And the county seat? Mount Vernon. And now you know the story behind Thomas Posey, our last territorial governor. I hope you've enjoyed your time with Hoosier Memories, and I thank you for listening.